Hello and welcome to the Summit Forum. My name is Aaron Clem, and I work here in the publishing department at Summit, and we are so excited to have you here for the Summit Forum series. Our guest today is longtime Summit faculty member Kevin Bywater. Kevin is the director of the Oxford Study Center in England. Previously, he served at Summit Ministries on staff for 25 years, working as a researcher, author, speaker, and the director of our curriculum and research departments. In 2008, he founded Summit Oxford, now known as the Oxford Study Center. Kevin holds degrees in philosophy and theology, and he has strong interests in biblical theology and Old and New Testament relationships, and as well as his wider attention spans certainly many worldview concerns. Formerly a Mormon, Kevin became a Christian while attending university, and he has a keen interest in comparative religion and apologetics, as well as how we might best live in a persuasive way with our Christian witness in a post-Christian culture. We're thrilled to have him speaking with us, and thank you, Kevin, for hanging out with us today.
It's an honor and a pleasure.
Our topic today that we're going to be talking about is building relationships through hospitality and building bridges, in fact, with hospitality and relationship as well. So why don't you say we just jump on in? Huh?
Sure.
So the first thing I just want to cover is kind of setting a tone for our conversation. Hospitality, when I think of that word, I think of cleanliness, food, maybe hotel service, something like that. What do you think of when you think of hospitality? Help us just so get all on the same page for this topic.
Sure. Sometimes when we hear the word hospitality, we do think of the service industry. Mm-hmm. And I think that's because the center of hospitality is service. Mm-hmm. It's where we serve other people. And we can serve them not in a hotel, but in our houses. And I see hospitality, the core of it being service, generosity, invitation, and embrace.
I think that's a good pillar. So what were those kind of four things?
Service, generosity, invitation, and embrace.
Excellent. I think those are some good pillars to kind of guide our conversation. So I've had the pleasure of hearing you speak at even just our recent B conference here in Colorado in March, and you spoke specifically on this topic. And you mentioned at the beginning of one of your lectures kind of a deeper connection you have with this idea of living intentionally as a Christian. And when you first became a Christian, coming back home to a Mormon community and the importance of that. Explain how that's kind of tied into this idea.
Right. Not only coming out of Mormonism, but living in a Mormon culture, but also living in the UK now for 14 and a half years. I'm familiar with living in a non-Christian context. And when you live in a non-Christian context, Christian assumptions are not shared. Neither our convictions, nor our practices, nor our presuppositions. And therefore, you have to be more explicit in terms of your personal convictions and how you live your life. Otherwise, the cultural influences can easily pull you off, sort of the straight and narrow path. I think because of those opportunities, I've had to live more intentionally.
And it seems to me, just thinking about the culture that we live in, that this is something that we should all be more aware of, because this is an issue that's becoming more and more prevalent as we look around, as we, even within our churches, experience people who don't maybe have the same set of beliefs or aren't coming in with the same presuppositions to a discussion that we might be. So even if we don't live around a lot of Muslim neighbors or in a Mormon community or things like that, there's still a lot of relevance to this. Would you agree?
Indeed. And as we see American culture become increasingly hostile to Christian convictions and to Christian communities, I think we're going to have to be more conscious and conscientious and intentional in living out our lives so that we can have really a witness for Christ that is intentional and not simply accidental.
Yeah. So why is this an important, so this all sounds good. It sounds like just kind of the doing good for the sake of good, right? I have friends who would use that exact phrase. How does this connect specifically to our faith? What's kind of the biblical command behind this, if you will?
So when I've thought about hospitality and reflected on it over the years, I need to admit, first of all, I'm not an inherently hospitable person. I'm an introvert. I enjoy not being around people. But I've learned to love people more than having my own solitude. And when it comes to hospitality, I often think about food and think about fellowship. And what I found in reflecting on the scriptures is that God is a hospitable God. God starts in chapter 1 of Genesis providing food. Chapter 2, that gets explained further. Chapter 3, things go astray. But even further in the Old Testament, you think of how Melchizedek greeted Abraham with food. You think about the feasts in the Old Testament. Coming into the New Testament, you have Jesus who's eating with people and talking about suppers together and feasts together. And the Bible even concludes on that note of food. And so man does not live by bread alone, but bread is present. And so I've thought about those things, but only after the fact of practicing hospitality. And I'll tell you what, Aaron, one of the things that I found over the years is that when we cultivate habits of hospitality in our home, inviting people in, non-Christians, Christians with whom we disagree, doesn't matter. When we cultivate those habits of hospitality, we found that it is the best bulwark against hostility on the one hand and hypocrisy on the other. Hostility because when you're generous to people, they tend to warm up to you. They tend to trust you more simply because you're trustworthy. And I think a bulwark against hypocrisy because when you're practicing hospitality, you have to be transparent. They're in your home. You're serving them. Kids might misbehave, whatever. They get to see you in action and not simply in a performance.
Yeah, so really two things of following kind of God's example that he sets before us.
Indeed.
As well as then it's just should be at least a natural part of living out our faith. How do you feel like this let's go down the idea of, you mentioned this isn't a skill for you, for example. This is not something that comes naturally,
Yes.
yet something it sounds like you practice frequently.
Yes.
How do you, if I say, look, this is not a gift that I've been given. Some people are warm, inviting, welcoming in their homes. I want to be alone. I want my time to myself. I want to be able to experience that. Can I still be hospitable in other ways? Can I be hospitable outside of my home?
Right.
What does that look like? How can I start to wrestle through that?
Yeah, so that opens in a number of really important considerations, I think. Not all of us have hospitality space in our homes, and we might be at university and you've got some small apartment that has a table that's about the size of the bottom of your chair seat or something.
Yeah.
So again, the core of hospitality is service. And if that's the case, then you can find ways of serving people. And if hospitality is expressed through generosity, then generosity can happen even outside of your home in other places. People can be served in their homes, perhaps. And so I think that this is something that does carry out. Now, back to the question, though, of it's not my gift. Well, the way I see that is that I don't have the gift of evangelism, but that doesn't mean I have no responsibility for it. I don't have the gift of encouragement, but that doesn't mean I have no responsibility for that. And I think I would say I don't have the gift of hospitality, but what we've found is that we still have responsibility for that. And in fact, the payout of being generous and inviting people and embracing them is this. It's a great context in which to cultivate credibility. And what I found is that when we are serving people in whatever fashion, they're more likely to trust us, to listen to us. And I don't want to treat this simply as a pragmatic thing. Let's do all we can to make them like us so that they'll hear the truth. But I also don't want to leave that off. It's an important thing as someone who is an ambassador for Christ. We're called to bear witness. And I think this is a wonderful way to create that credible context so that our witness can be more effective.
I think of this, and I can't help but thinking of kind of the summit phrase of truth and relationship. I mean, we're talking much on the relationship side, but all for the purpose of truth. So when I'm having those kind of conversations, as I'm inviting people who may disagree with me, let's fast forward a bit. I've invited them into my home. I've served them. This is maybe a developed relationship, and we're in the midst of a conversation that's becoming a little bit more heated and emotional,
Sure.
and maybe not heated at that person, but just something we're passionate about.
Right.
How do you deal with that, working through that relationship, and still knowing that, again, we're working off of very different presuppositions with all likelihood?
Yeah. So as you might imagine, given not just the topics I speak on, but as a practitioner of the things that I speak on, I've had a lot of conversations with people in our home and outside of our home that are fairly passionate. One of the things I've learned over the years is to remain calm myself. And something that's helped me to remain calm is to recognize right up front, I'm not going to have all the answers, and I will have an opportunity to learn from other people, even non-Christians. It's a fabulous thing to learn from people, and it's, I think, regretful when we don't take that opportunity. But another thing is that being here at Summit for 25 years and learning from some of the speakers that were here and being a speaker myself, I've learned to sort of hang back and ask questions. And so if people get passionate about these ideas, I can relax, I can start asking them just simple questions. And in effect, turn into an interviewer like you are today, and just learn about them. And sometimes I can put off the touchy, passionate conversations to our next meeting. Not everything has to happen that one time. And so practicing patience, inviting them over again, spending more time with them, and learning. It's a long process. I don't feel like I have to know everything all at once any longer. I used to feel that way when I was younger. But now it's okay. And if things get passionate, I can hang back, let people vent. I don't need to worry about that. Ask them some questions, find out why the topic affects them so strongly. And I think by doing those things, responding that way, that's showing them respect. And I think when they see that I respect them instead of just arguing back at them and trying to win the argument, that again builds rapport and creates credibility with them.
So maybe we've sped ahead a little too much. Let me step back a little bit here and ask just some more practical ways to execute this. So you've mentioned food, lots of conversation. This could happen in different contexts. What are some, in your life, within your family, what are some practical ways that you've approached this idea of, I want to do this, I want to live this out intentionally?
So both inside and outside of our home. Outside of our home, when I'm in Oxford or really wherever I'm at, so if I'm traveling, I don't have a chance to invite them to our table.
Sure.
But I might have a chance to invite them to a table, whether we go to a restaurant or to a coffee shop or something like that. I just find that using food, using drinks, it's a way to enjoy these good gifts that God has given us and a way of being generous to people. And also it's a way of illustrating just that invitation and embrace. I want to spend time with you. I want to chat with you. Let's do this. And I'll just go wherever. Doesn't matter. But the other side of it is that in our home, we found over the years that when we invite, say, for instance, non-Christians into our home, we want to show them respect. We want to acknowledge their dignity. We want to treat them as made in the image of God, which they are. We find that by doing that time and time and time again, they enjoy being around us. They return time and time again. And we have further opportunities to open up those conversations that maybe the first time we chatted about them were heated or had that potential, whereas 3 months or 3 years later, they're comfortable with that. They know that we're safe, but that we are very happy to have open and explicit conversations about our deepest convictions. That's not something that a lot of people like doing.
Yeah, it can be
and
uncomfortable for sure.
Sometimes it's uncomfortable for us because another thing is that when we treat people this way, we find that they return that favor. They invite us to their homes. They initiate the conversations. And they want to find out what our convictions are and what motivates us. And what a great opportunity to bear witness verbally when they do that.
You know, I can't help but think that sounds maybe easier for someone like yourself who studies this stuff day in and day out, and who's very clear on their theology, their ideas about certain convictions. What if I'm, afraid of what these non-believers maybe, or even just different Christians might be, questions they might raise that I don't have the answers to?
Yeah.
How do I approach that?
Well, I will say that I feel that way sometimes too. I might know a good bit about certain things, but I don't know everything. Mm-hmm. And I always expect other people to be more clever than I am. And so I don't want to have an arrogance, nor a false humility. Mm-hmm. So I'm simply willing to, here's what I would say. If you're afraid of doing it, do it with someone else. Bring a friend. Do it with some friends. Do it with your family. If your fears are, unfounded, you'll discover that. If your fears are founded, then I suggest simply showing them respect, giving them space, interviewing them effectively, asking good questions, is a great way to say, I'm not here to attack you. And if you don't know answers to certain things, join the club. I've been there, and I'm still there with certain issues where I don't feel like I have closure. Mm-hmm. But then take the time to learn. There's plenty of time. I've been a Christian now for 30 years, and there are lots of things that I didn't figure out early on that I was able to get some clue about later. And I also learned this, Aaron. I learned how to say, that's a really interesting idea. I have no idea what to think of that. I need to ponder that for a while.
Yeah, the willingness to not feel like you have to retort something immediately.
There are probably few things worse than faking it, making up some answer and a reply that's just radically inadequate. That's not of service to anyone. And that sort of a response will destroy your credibility. So it's much better, I think, and I've learned this the hard way, it's much better to say, I'm not sure what to make of that. I need some time.
Yeah, I think that's important for us to remember, because as you said, there's always going to be issues that we maybe haven't fully thought through, or if we think we've thought through them, that sometimes people will be more clever than us and ask a question in a way that we're like, I'm not sure how to really address that.
Yeah.
I find myself in that situation frequently, where I'm confident in what I believe and I kind of know why I think that, what's led me to that conclusion, but maybe not every angle of attack I may receive, or just questioning I may receive, not even attack.
Certainly. Let me add one other thing that I think is important as well, and that is we tend to avoid gotcha questions. When you're trying to show people respect, humiliating them is not showing them respect. Simply being smarter than they are is not showing them respect. And years ago, there was something that I learned, again, the hard way. And I've summarized it in a phrase, and it goes this way. Sometimes it's better to be good than to be right, because when you're right in the wrong way, it does no good. And so, I'm not saying it's good to be wrong. Yeah. What I'm saying is that sometimes we don't have to have that at the forefront, that we're right about this, but rather treating people with that respect. And then you can get to the truth later, maybe. But let them know that this is safe, that they can be themselves, and that you really want to know who they are, so that you can invest in their lives. That's just something that people cherish.
Yeah. There's an inherent part of us that can appreciate this being respected, this patience, this sense of being reserved and calm, and that's hard to get upset at. And so, if we can approach these conversations with that way, there's certainly a path at least towards success, or at least a greater level of comfort and relationship there.
I find it's even calming for me, because I'm sort of a nervous personality. That may not be obvious, but it's why I'm holding onto the table. I can get nervous in those situations just like anyone else. I find if I just slow down, find out more about them, give them something else to eat or to drink, see what their convictions are, explore those things. I don't always have to put my convictions out on the table. They usually know my convictions roughly anyway, but I don't have to press through it too quickly. And I find taking that time really can bear fruit. And I found that over the course of, in one relationship, 3 years, and another relationship closer to 10 years. But I'm willing to still invest. And, it reminds me of what the Apostle Paul says. Some people plant, other people water. God causes the increase. I'm not there to cause the increase. I'm there to bear witness, to plant those seeds. As a student said to me, I think it was yesterday, we plant seeds and pull weeds. And just do it over the course of time. And so if we think of those agricultural metaphors, you can't be hasty as a farmer. You've got to take your time. Seeds, plants grow at their own pace. So yeah, I enjoy investing in people's lives and seeing the fruit happen many years later.
Right. That's good. So as I think about this, you're clearly drawing on some actual examples that you guys have, as a family, experienced. How do you go about kind of selecting? Maybe that's the wrong phrase, but picking the relationships to pursue, to dig deeper in. We all have plenty of people we know, coworkers and friends at church and parents of our kids' friends and everything else. How do you go about saying, this is someone I want to invest in, this is someone I want to serve and be hospitable to and welcome into my home? Or, they can fill a lot of different personalities. So how do you approach that?
I am not confident that I'm that deliberate. I think it's more intuitive, or perhaps more of a judgment call that we might make. I don't want to do anything that puts my family at some distinct risk. But at the same time, as a family, we've long talked about these things, talked about having people who don't share our convictions in our house and caring for them. So deciding, I guess if you have too many people to pick from, that's a great place to be in.
Good problem to have.
And
right?
I would say just start somewhere. Just go with it. But it's good also to try to consider the risks. If you have someone who's going to be speaking on the subject of sexuality or sexual identity with some frequency, or maybe that's something that is their expressed identity, then we'll talk to our children about the situation. And my wife, Angela, and I will talk about these things, pray about these things, maybe seek counsel of someone that we think knows more than we know and can give us some advice, or someone who's struggled through things. But it's just, I think it's a practice. I think it's just something you put into practice. And we learn over time how to do it better.
Just do it. Just jump in.
Start somewhere.
Give it a shot.
Look, there have been times when people have come into our homes and I've been far too hasty to have a fairly aggressive conversation with them. Yeah. And I've had to apologize and say, sorry, these are just really strong convictions for me. Let's go eat.
Yeah.
And I find that sometimes appetizers are the apologetics. And I don't know that I have to create an argument. I just have to create a space for mutual consideration.
Yeah, that's good. So don't rush it. Take your time, but do something. Take an action and do something.
You've got to practice it. I think the Christian faith is a practice. We often say that Christianity is a religion, or not a religion, but a relationship. But in every relationship I know, you have to practice it. You have to invest in other people. And I think that there's some truth to this. But I talk about habits of hospitality, not simply the practice of hospitality. And the only way you can have a habit is if you start doing it.
So we've talked a lot about what it would look like inside your home or even just in your life, in a daily life. What does this look like inside the church specifically? I mean, is this more than just coffee and donuts on Sunday morning? Is this, what does this look like within the church structure? How can this feed the church, build it up? Or is this really something that's intended with the idea of our kind of external relationships, if you will?
It is really difficult to answer this question because churches are different, communities are different, cultures are different. And so some churches already have certain features of hospitality within the church, and there might be some meals that are enjoyed in the church, or again, coffee and donuts or something like this. But if the core of hospitality is service, I think the first thing that it looks like is learning how to serve in the church. Reaching out to help people, being discerning and listening to where people are to see what it might be. It might be helping someone who needs their lawn mown, or someone who needs some painting done. It's service, first and foremost, but more often in my life, I see it as food. And meals, because I find that when you eat with someone, it just opens something up in a relationship with them. But I never want to reduce it to that.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good annotation to add to that. Don't reduce it to that. There's something more going on, but it is certainly a good avenue to get closer to that, to go deeper with someone.
Yes.
This makes me think of in Acts chapter 6 when the formation of the deacon ministry. There was kind of the command to go out to the people who needed physical care, the people who needed more than just spiritual care. Is there a connection there? Is this something that's kind of, am I going down a different path altogether? Or how does that relate to the church and how we need to act?
Yeah, I think that's a really important and pressing question. So the reason why that arises in the book of Acts is some of the widows are being neglected.
Right.
And of course, neglect isn't supposed to be a Christian practice.
Right.
It's certainly not a virtue.
Certainly not a habit.
And so I think we can learn from that, not simply in terms of the diaconate and the practice of serving and caring for people's needs, but I think in the sense of being attentive to people's needs. So I think we bump up against this need for attentiveness in a variety of passages in Scripture, not just in the book of Acts, but if you think of how the Apostle Paul chastises the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians with regards to how they're doing the Lord's Supper. And he says, I have nothing good to say about what I've heard. And if you read the passage, second half of 1 Corinthians 11, I believe, he talks about how some of you are going ahead and eating, and you're drinking, even getting drunk, but you are effectively humiliating the people who have nothing, neglecting them. And there are a couple of things I think to take away from that passage. One is, I think we need to open our eyes and try to see when we're neglecting people. And the second thing is to not practice the ways of the world in our church. There are plenty of public prejudices where we have class divisions and distinctions, but those are disallowed in the church. They are not to be imported, because what happens is they can foster that neglect, that disregard, that disrespect, and that humiliation of people who are not as wealthy or not as intelligent or not as able or not as beautiful or whatever we want to use. But those sorts of prejudices are not to be imported into the church. Jesus redeemed us from those things.
Where in your life have you seen examples of kind of some success? How this has worked over you mentioned a relationship over 10 years, as well as I think it could be helpful to be honest about some failures, some ways that you've had to work through either correcting that or just saying, okay, God, I need to let that be someone else's duty to work on.
I guess in one sense, I don't think of this in terms of success and failure. It's sort of like how we sometimes think about evangelism. Sometimes we think success in evangelism is conversions. I see success in evangelism as faithful witness. And so I have no preconceived outcome when I invite people into our home. Apart from, we have a great opportunity here to show that generosity and that embrace and that respect and to get to know them and perhaps to learn things from them. And that's enough. We will bear witness of Christ's grace. They know that we're Christians. It's hard for us to hide that. Walk into our house and see our bookshelf or something, and it's pretty obvious. But we talk about our loyalty to Christ, our allegiance to Christ, our fidelity to Christ, with some frequency anyway. A failure, I think a failure is when I've found myself disrespecting someone, cutting them off, not letting them speak, not genuinely listening to their answers. Those are the sorts of failures I want to avoid. A failure on my part is not, oh, they didn't come to faith in Christ, because I'm not in charge of that. I plant, I water, God causes the increase.
Right back to that increase.
So my job is to do that cultivation. God's job is to convert their hearts. So what I want to do, though, is to make sure I'm practicing my part properly. So how have we seen this happen, though? This is kind of interesting. We lived in England for 14 and a half years. It's a very multicultural society. I'm under the impression that less than 10% of the people go to church with any regularity, and perhaps less than 10% of the churches are worth going to with any regularity. It's kind of a tough culture.
Yeah.
But just a little glimpse into our lives. One of our daughters, her closest friends from school, look like this. One of them comes from an atheist family, and they're explicitly atheistic. And in social media, they'll be aggressively atheistic. In person, they're not.
Sure.
And social media does that to us.
It's a little easier,
I'm Dr.
right?
Jekyll until I'm on Facebook, and then I'm Mr. Hyde.
Yeah.
And we've got to be really careful with that temptation. But atheist family, close friends, they know we're Christians, but their daughter is over at our house with some regularity, and our daughter is at their house with some regularity. Second friend, she tells us that they're not atheists, they're not Christians, they're not anything. They've never discussed it.
Okay.
And that's hard for me to appreciate because that's such a part of our discussions. We see those deepest convictions as really central to our lives.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, that's another one of her friends. Third friend, Hindu family.
Okay.
The parents practice Hinduism. The children are involved in certain holidays, and they abide by the food restrictions. Fourth friend, Muslim family.
Okay, we're really creating.
It's like a little multicultural experiment all by itself. But these are wonderful children, and they have wonderful families, and we appreciate the dynamic relationship that we have with them. But we don't shy away from having conversations with them. And this is something where we've learned over the years that when we're spending time with people like this, who are our friends or acquaintances, that it breaks down certain stereotypes and misperceptions, preconceptions that we might have. Yeah. So, for instance, her Muslim friend, just absolutely happy-go-lucky kid, loves to laugh. Favorite band is 21 Pilots. Okay. Which I think maybe she likes the song "All My Friends Are Heathens." I don't know if that's the case or not, but that's interesting to see. Yeah. And while she is in the throes of puberty, she doesn't wear a head covering, but her mother does. Okay. And so now you've got those interesting religious and cultural social dynamics that are being negotiated in their family. And it helps us to not think that all Muslims are this way or all Hindus are this way or all atheists are that way.
They're people. They're
and
just
it also,
like
I think, helps them say not all Christians are however they may have conceived of us. So when our daughter has a birthday party, those are the friends who are over. When those children have birthday parties, those are the friends who are over at their houses. And it's a really beautiful thing to see that our daughter can care for them. She doesn't avoid them. She doesn't have any weird suspicions about them. And that's something that happens. I think often we have suspicions because we don't get to know people. And we get our knowledge about Islam by watching television or the internet. We think that all Muslims are terrorists, or far too many of them are. Yeah. When in fact, a lot of the Muslims I've met have sought to escape Islamic culture precisely to enjoy the peace that we have in our cultures. And that's something that I've learned in dialogue with them rather than just from some book.
Yeah. Yeah, so you brought up these as friends of your daughters, and so as if I'm a parent, which I'm not, but and I'm looking at how do I kind of mold my kids into the same attitude? What are ways that I can have conversations? What are ways that you've approached that mentality as from a young age, but then also as they've matured and started having these relationships of their own?
Yeah, really important question. Being a father is a bit of an experiment.
Yeah.
Okay, so sometimes you just learn on the go. But the thing that I've learned along these lines, Aaron, is not to simply lecture our kids, not to simply instruct them, but to exemplify these things so they see it in practice. They see it in action, and it becomes so familiar that it's now the normal for them.
Yeah.
And I think that is the best way to do it. But we will debrief after certain events or certain conversations so that we can process together as a family. How can we better care for these people? What words should we have avoided, maybe? Or what could we have said that we failed to say? Or what would be a better menu next time?
Yeah. So the whole range of just how can we approach this whole thing as a family, as together, maybe things that, maybe I did it incorrectly or could have done better, or things that, as teaching and cultivating children is say, hey, instead of saying this, maybe we could say this. So
Yeah.
I think that's a great level of humility of saying, I'm not going to get it right, but we're going to try and just work through this and learn on the go, which is much of our lives, right? I mean, we have to do that a lot.
It is. I sort of think of this as analogous to being a medical doctor who has a medical practice, or being a lawyer who has a legal practice. You're not perfect. You don't know everything. You're doing your best to help your clients. And as a Christian, I think what we do is we have a basic level of learning. We put it into practice, and we learn more along the way.
Yeah. There's something for everyone to learn, no matter what level of maturity and
I feel like
faith.
my life would be boring if I were not still learning.
Yeah, it's an important lesson, even when it sometimes seems a little daunting or hard to do, but a good one, and one we've been called to.
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed.
So to kind of add just a different factor to this, in the last 15 years, the amount of technology in our homes. We're talking a lot about inviting people into our homes. How is technology both something that could be a distraction and needs to be monitored, but how can it also help us in this area of hospitality, of relationship building?
Yeah, so that's another interesting question. I think my answer has to be simply based on our own family practice, okay? So I think it can be different for other people's households.
Sure.
I have no rules per se.
Right.
But for us, 19 years ago, we got rid of our television. And we've not had a television since. What we found, my wife and I, was that when we turned on the television after a long day at work, we found that the television sucked away all of our time. And we found that when we had a television and we had people over, it sucked away opportunities for conversations. We don't think that every time we have people over, it has to be a conversation. In fact, for instance, for our Oxford Study Center program, we have a lot of hospitality with our students. They're in our home for a meal every Friday evening. And we will eat. We will not have intellectual conversations afterwards unless a student is destabilized with some issue. What we will do is we'll eat, and then we play games. We might watch a film. And if they're watching the film, I'm typically in the kitchen making popcorn of various varieties.
Sure.
Again, just continuing the hospitality, because I know if I were watching the film, I would enjoy the popcorn too. And sometimes I'll sit down and watch the film with them, but otherwise I'm doing that.
It's really good stuff. I think with technology, I think we need to be willing to utilize it, but be thoughtful about how we're utilizing it. So if there's, hospitality taking place, inviting someone into our home on a regular basis, like your students every Friday, there's a chance to have technology incorporated at a certain percentage, right?
Yeah.
There's a level of engagement that's available, but not all of that time being taken away.
Right. So I think it's a judgment call on that front. If you always say, let's spend time together playing group solitaire, that's what it's like when you're watching a film. You know, you're not engaging with each other necessarily. Hopefully not, because that kind of ruins watching the film.
Yeah.
But, you know, there's a time and place for the enjoyment of technology, for watching the films, for playing the games, for having deeper conversations, for eating the food. And I think this is something that's truly a matter of wisdom. Just try to be wise about this. Make the most of the opportunity if you can.
Yeah.
But don't think it all has to be conversation either. Again, cultivating a context of credibility doesn't have to be with words.
Yeah.
It can be with the food, with the drink, with a game that you play. It's letting people get to know you and that you're actually there to enjoy them, to care for them, and perhaps even to invest in their well-being, which is what we're called to do. Loving our neighbors, the way I phrase it, is genuinely enhancing the well-being of our neighbors.
Yeah.
And that's what we need to be about.
Yeah, something not yet mentioned, but I think important, and maybe kind of draws us to a close, maybe putting an exclamation point on this. If, you know, these are our neighbors, and this is, you know, one of the greatest commands, to love our neighbor.
Yeah.
And so these are ways we can do that. We can do that through service. We can do that through generosity, inviting people into our home. You know, these just being some of the things that we've talked about here. We can do this through long-term relationship, through vulnerability, through as well as the willingness to make mistakes and have moments of failure, if you will, moments of that you may have to walk back and say, "Oh, let's sit down and eat." You know,
I mean, it's a practice, isn't it?
Sometimes, right?
Do it again. Try it again. Next time, try not to burn it.
Yeah.
You know, don't burn the relationship. Don't burn the food. But if you do, you just look at them and smile and say, "We're going out tonight."
Yeah.
Or I'll be right back from the shops. And we had to do those things. It's okay.
Yeah.
It's just life, and they get to see us then living our lives.
Yeah.
And you know what? After you do this for a while, it is just natural. It's just a practice. You don't. It's not necessarily conscious.
Yeah.
It's just part of what you do.
Yeah. Yeah, it becomes a practice, a sense of, I think this all leads us to, this is the way we should be living our lives day in and day out. And we don't do that perfectly. But the more that we can show people that we don't do it perfectly, I think breaks down some of the stereotypes that people perceive of who Christians are and what we think we are here to do. And, where instead we're people just like every other people, and we want to just be with them in community, in relationship.
Perfection is not my goal.
No. Well, that's good, because we can't live to that goal.
Yeah, loyalty, respect, hospitality. And again, just to mention what I mentioned earlier, and that is that I believe having these habits of hospitality can be the best bulwark against hostility on the one hand and hypocrisy on the other. Two vices that are right now percolating through our culture and acting as a divisive acid between people. Yeah. And I will add one final thing, and that is that I see that hospitality is an alternative to tolerance. I know that sounds counterintuitive.
No, that's interesting.
But tolerance, as it's currently spread, suggests affirmation, agreement with people. Yeah. But tolerance properly means you disagree, but you tolerate. Okay? But the other problem with tolerance, to my mind, is that it's very easy when you're trying to tolerate people to be apathetic about them. Yeah. To say, well, I'll tolerate them by having nothing to do with them. And then, in a sense, that's sort of, I'll let them do their thing.
Yeah.
But apathy is not a Christian virtue.
No. And
so I think that a better alternative than tolerance is hospitality. It keeps you investing in people's lives. It keeps you caring about people. And for me, it's important for me to practice this. Otherwise, I fall prey to being more interested in ideas than individuals. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good close for us as we think about this being an important thing to break down, a simple thing, really. Nothing we've talked about has been
challenging
Shouldn't be
or
all that
impossible.
profound or anything.
Yeah, but it's simple daily practices, ways we can live, ways we can engage with people around us, with people we may not know super well, and people we may know very well, and in turn we'll see results in the Spirit's work in that cultivation if we're faithful.
Indeed, and even in our own lives.
Yeah, yes, there's certainly a sense of reward to developing those relationships and having people in our lives. So thanks, Kevin, so much for speaking with us today. We really appreciate it. I know I learned some new things, and I really hope our listeners enjoyed some of the material you were sharing with us as well. So if you enjoyed watching this forum, you can check our previous forums at summit.org/alumni, and you can take a look at all sorts of different topics and speakers there. Stay tuned for our next forum. We'll be sitting down with Summit faculty member Mike Adams, who will be discussing the campus culture and giving us just kind of an update on where things are at with that. And thanks so much for joining us. Have a good one.